all countries. When you look at the memoirs of, as I say, even military people, they're saying, if we do this, we're stuffed. You get people in the German Empire saying, if we do this, the German Empire's finished. In Russia, the Russian Empire's finished. And in France, this will finish us. And so those sort of narratives were sort of conveniently forgotten. And people actually did think right up until the brink. I mean, when the Archduke and his wife were killed, people sort of hardly noticed it. It got one line in the Irish Times. Of course, that was because you had the Home Rule Act in Ireland, and that was the key thing in British newspapers, not the assassination of the Archduke. And in France, you had the Caillot scandal, where the wife of a prominent French politician shot the editor of Le Figaro because he'd pulled out letters when they have indiscretion of many years before.
Wow.
So, all the rest of it. So, that's in the media were talking about Mrs. Caillot and how she walked into this is all over Europe, how she walked into the editorial office of Le Figaro and took out a revolver, which she'd bought earlier that day, and shot the editor. And then she got off. Of course, the attitude of women then were very different. She got off with she was a woman, so her lawyer pleaded temporary insanity, and that worked at that time. But people's focus when the Archduke was killed was in different things. They thought it was just going to be another one of these crises that the politicians would sort of deal with, like Morocco, the Agadir crisis, stuff like that occurred earlier. So it will be interesting to see if that sort of stuff is going to be discussed. It will be interesting to see if there's a sort of Pickles view of it comes out of, that this was some sort of righteous war that was worth the fight, as opposed to a war that was a waste of time.
When there's these kind of big pageants, if you like, I know that's not exactly the right word, the big statist events, whether it's something at the Cenotaph or a Jubilee or something, there's never really any serious analysis of it. This is what the Queen's wearing, and isn't it a sombre event, and isn't it wonderful? I don't expect there's going to be any serious analysis around the event. It'll be a TV day in the sun for a few of them.
Yeah, well, we will see. I mean, I noticed that, but this is happening both in Scotland and down south. They're giving subsidies to schools who are already going to go to the Western Front over the next few years for trip visits to the Western Front battlefields. What I would like to see is maybe instead of having Greece for a school show, it's up to the schools to do what they want, of course. But they might get a subsidy if they decide to do their musical as "Oh, What a Lovely War." That would be it'd be an interesting musical to be performed at a school.
Absolutely.
And that shows you. I mean, even if imagine what were to happen if a school decided, no, we're not going to do Greece. We're going to do, or we're not going to do Oliver. But a school show for 2014 is going to be "Oh, What a Lovely War."
Well, you're a member of the EIS, so I think you'd be protecting your members from a media onslaught very quickly. Yeah.
I mean, the tabloids just run with these things, and you just live with it. But that's just part of life.
So just to finish on that first part of this podcast, do you think it's going to work for them? Do you think they're going to create a massive sense of unity with this, or do you think it's going to be something that's going to backfire? That
will depend. I mean, I think people have to engage in a wider discourse. I mean, there's something I didn't mention, which is again worrying. I mean, you think, maybe it's aye, maybe it's no, maybe Cameron is tacking this way, that he's trying to play it carefully. But apparently, one of the proposals is that there will be street names are going to be changed. They're going to go into a list of winners of the Victoria Cross, and in various parts of Britain, apparently, streets are going to be renamed after VC winners from World War One. There's almost a degree of militarization to some extent of, there are cultural things that are occurring in terms of a relationship with the military. Don't get me wrong. I mean, some of these things I think are okay. I mean, I don't agree with our foreign expeditions either in Afghanistan or in Iraq. But on the other hand, if we live in a democratic society and we send servicemen and women to go and fight in the war, then they deserve our unstinted support, as far as I'm concerned. So in one sense, a lot of the initiatives to support veterans, both wounded and not, these are really good initiatives, because we don't want to see ex-service people who have served abroad, whether we agree with these wars are not being treated, not getting the best of our support, because at the end of the day, the people responsible for these actions are the citizens of a democratic society. And if we decide to have professional armed forces, then they deserve our full support.
Then you get a government who just makes another pageant and doesn't do anything about what's almost certain to exist, which is something like Gulf War syndrome.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, but what I'm trying to say is I'm trying to qualify what I was about to say, which is notwithstanding supporting our service personnel, there is, in fact, I would say it's actually a conscious decision of the government to try and engender public support, not just for the armed services, but for military operations. I was looking recently at an MSc paper that was being written by a lieutenant colonel who's away in a staff course in the States about public opinion in future conflict in Britain. How you need to develop public opinion. If you're going to do that, you need to be careful about public opinion. And if you look at how things have changed in the last few years, I'm not just talking about Wootton Bassett and all the rest of that. That's understandable, but you're now seeing phenomena that we haven't seen since the days of empire. Units are coming back from foreign tours and they're having march-throughs of wee towns here and there. That was a feature of military culture during the days of the empire. It's now being brought back again. Things like that. There are disturbing signs, the Sun runs some sort of competition for the best unit or something like that every year, which is, a worrying degree of sort of militarisation. And I see that to some extent with this commemoration of World War I, certainly this commemoration of the Battle of Waterloo, trying to almost... You see it in America to some extent, the relationship between Hollywood and the military. I mean, every third movie that comes out of the States, has got some sort of military subtext, and the military are there in the background or something like that.
Hollywood's sort of the first recruiting office for the American military.
Indeed. And you can see, there's hardly, a sort of movie, non-romantic movie that comes out where, there aren't people in uniform and, involved to some extent. And, people think because we live in a democratic society that we're not being incorporated to some, the military culture isn't being developed. I mean, for instance, as I say, I'll go back to the example of the musical, What a Lovely War. It did come out, I believe, as a musical. The film was later in the late 60s. But it came out as a musical in the early 1960s. You could imagine that coming out as a musical being worked up into a film in the mid-60s, and then someone suggesting we're going to commemorate World War I. There would have been a real culture clash with that. Will the film Oh, What a Lovely War be shown, for instance? At some suitable point it probably will, part away, compartmentalised. But you're even seeing, the Imperial War Museum, which is apparently one of the main organisations involved in this whole commemorative event. Some of the military academia are already moaning that it's all going about Wilfred Owen and the poems and the slaughter and all the rest of it, instead of the supposed positive advantages in military technology. It's quite creepy. But they will be kept, they will be managed, they will be kept in place because, if those sort of let loose and the media pick up them, Cameron will be banging his head off the table because that's not what he wants to talk about. His message will be far softer, far more pervasive, far more subtle than that sort of stuff.
Okay, so I think we can move on to part 2 of this, and I'll just start this with a little question about yourself first before we move on. You are a senior EIS activist, but you're and trade unionist, but you're also an independence supporter. So just before we get to the subject of unions and independence, I'd just like to ask you personally, what was it that convinced you that independence was the right thing?
I've been an SNP supporter, I suppose, for most of my adult life. I'm 57. I voted in, was it 70, when were there were 2 elections, was it 74? There was 2 elections. And in the first election I voted Labour, in the second election I voted SNP. Basically, I suppose it's the left nationalist argument that I have supported. As I've got older, I've become a bit more left-wing. I started my political activity, I suppose you might say, soon after leaving university as an SNP activist, but I became active in the IS, and although I'm an SNP member, I have been a candidate many years ago. My political activity is through my trade union, and it's not so much party, although I say I'm an SNP member and I do attend SNP events, and I've always worn my SNP membership on my sleeve, which has caused problems from time to time in some union fora. But what convinced me was basically, I suppose, the left, social democracy is safer in Scotland than it is down south. We're seeing deconstruction of the, previous people you've had on have talked about the deconstruction of the welfare state that's, taking place in front of our eyes down south. Which is an interesting point about in terms of that deconstruction, which was about political theatre. Just one final point about political theatre, though in a welfare context, where Cameron is very good at it. The Olympic opening ceremony, the NHS being the centrepiece. Yet right now, the NHS down south is being deconstructed. Yeah. I mean, a colleague of mine in Unison, back to the union side of things you were talking about, a colleague of mine in Unison said that when Unison activists in the NHS in Scotland go down south and then they come back home, they sort of almost metaphorically wipe their brow and say, thank God we're up here as opposed to down there.
Yeah, it's just shockingly two-faced to have that ceremony whilst simultaneously selling off the NHS.
Oh, George Orwell would be proud of him, I'm sure.
Yeah. To come to the trade unions, I think it's a very interesting area because there's different noises that come out. I think a lot of the unions are quite angry with the Labour Party and have been for quite some time. But at the same time, a couple of unions, I think, have declared that they support Indy. Some have declared that they support the union, and some haven't said anything or are staying out of it. I mean, what do you think is the picture, first for the Scottish trade union ones, and then for Scottish members of national trade unions? But we'll start with just the Scottish ones. What's the kind of feelings you get in the meetings?
Well, I think you have to say that almost all of the unions, apart from the Educational Institute of Scotland, my union, the oldest teachers' trade union in the world, and one other teacher trade union, a small teacher trade union in Scotland, almost all of the other unions are UK unions. So in that sense, that's not unusual. And it should be said at the outset that some of the bigger general unions organise in the Republic of Ireland. So there won't be an issue about having unions that represent their members in independent Scotland and represent them in the remainder of the UK, because that happens right now. There are big unions in the UK that organise in the Republic of Ireland, so it's simply not a problem. So that's not an issue, and that's not a scare story that the No campaign are going to run. But to go back to your point, the picture is a really interesting one. I remember when Labour for Independence was set up some months ago, it was sometime last year. I remember at the time I was thinking to myself, is this a sort of shell organisation, a bit of a media device, by the Yes campaign? Because I didn't know. But a few months later, attending the Scottish Trade Union Congress, particularly in conversations with other trade unionists and other activists in the Trade Union Council in South Lanarkshire where I work, so I do have a lot of contact with members of other unions as well as my own. There seems to be a shift towards independence. The nearest equivalent I can think of is, and this term was used by another colleague when we were discussing it one day. It's almost like in certain areas where LGBT and gay people publicly come out, that trade unionists, particularly ones who are relatively prominent and have been active for many years, sort of coming out and declaring that they are in favour of independence. There is almost in a cultural sense, they sort of hold their breath and they say, I'm in favour of independence, and expecting a backlash. And that backlash in the main isn't coming. I think the trade unions in Scotland understand that their members vote SNP as much and more so than they vote Labour. And I think they also understand, and this is something that is anecdotal, I have to admit, but I do believe that more and more trade unionists, because they are political activists, with a small p in that sense, are coming to the conclusion that independence is the way forward.
So why do you think that's happening? And do you think it's going to come trickle, trickle, trickle?